If you were to ask Ben Tennyson, the Omnitrix is, as he puts it, the most powerful weapon in the universe. On the other hand, Azimuth, the creator of the Omnitrix, is very clear in saying he didn't create a weapon. Instead, he created the ultimate device for understanding all the beings in the universe. Very much in line with Ben's later interpretation of the device, with the whole I am one of everyone bit. However you spin it, however it's wielded by whoever's got it on their wrist, the Omnitrix is far from perfect, having quite a lot of malfunctions, issues, failures, whatever you want to call them. So I thought it was about time we catalogue each one of those failures in one reasonably tight video. As per usual, we'll be following my standard approach of covering things mostly in order, starting with the classic series, then Alien Force through Ultimate Alien, and wrapping things up with Omniverse, with a sprinkling of tangents and asides here and there. So getting started with it, we'll do a very brief overview on what the Omnitrix is and what I mean by failure before we get too far into things. For those of you more interested in the general workings of the Omnitrix, I'll leave a link to my definitive Every Omnitrix Explained video in the description. As simply as I can possibly put it, the Omnitrix is a device that allows its wearer to transform into whatever alien species they'd like, provided the species DNA is in its database, and considering there's a million odd DNA samples in there, there are quite a lot to choose from. As far as safeguards and all that, the Omnitrix does have quite a few. There's most famously the time out feature that forcibly reverts Ben or whoever's wearing it back to their original form, apparently to prevent any harm from happening to their original DNA or circumvent any complications with any particular alien forms. Though it seems a bit strange given we see a future Ben who spends most every waking moment not reverting back to his human form, and he seems pretty well off, even if his headspace wasn't all that great when we're first introduced to him. Then there's a feature that prevents the device from being forcibly removed, with the Omnitrix outputting these surges of energy that are pretty effective, even against the biggest, baddest villains in the series. There's also quite famously the self-destruct sequence, which we see a couple of times throughout the series. First in the classic series film, then later again at the end of Alien Force. This starting with the Omnitrix building up energy to a certain point, given enough time, it's enough to destroy the universe. Which isn't so cohesive with the idea that it's designed for peaceful cohabitation, but there's something about Azimuth being willing to destroy the universe if it meant preventing the Omnitrix from being in the wrong hands. Then there's the most common safeguard, being the Omnitrix always giving Ben the right alien for any given situation, which may very well explain away one of the more major failures shortly, but certainly more so feels like it comes into full effect in Ben 10 Omniverse, where Ben is very much given the right alien when it really came down to the series finale. Getting into the failures proper, and one I'm sure most everyone will be familiar with coming into this video, we have the many mistransformations of this series, where for a number of reasons, sometimes quite possibly the last safeguard we just discussed, Ben gets the wrong alien. Very often times, especially classic series Ben, wanting someone like Four Arms who can hit whatever the problem is very hard, and getting someone like Grey Matter who has to take a very different kind of approach. This resulting in all sorts of stressful situations like using Ripjaws far from any bodies of water, or, in most cases, Ben having to use aliens in all sorts of more creative ways, rather than just hitting things really hard. This being explained away later on in the series by Azimuth, who chalks up to user error, saying Ben's being too rough with the Omnitrix when slamming the device each time he transforms, leading to all these mistransformations, which certainly is a fun way to address it, but doesn't always feel like it really lines up. Piggybacking off of that for a moment, we also have all the times the device times out quicker than it should, or Ben remains transformed for longer than he really should, like with the time Ben was stuck as Grey Matter for the better part of an episode. Though again, you could very much argue that's the Omnitrix keeping Ben safe. A similar thing goes for when the Omnitrix is timed out, only to at the drop of a hat, be ready to go right the last second when Ben needs that transformation most. The Omnitrix recharging instantly and Ben immediately getting cannonballed seemingly out of nowhere, when he's about to get minced by Kevin comes to mind. And again feels very much like the result of that failsafe. And again, it does feel like this is very likely the reason that he is mistransforming in the first place, that the Omnitrix is choosing to give him cannonball in this situation. Now, if this were an iceberg style video, this would be where we start to get into that medium/lower levels, with all the ways external factors can mess about with the Omnitrix functioning as intended. Jumping ahead a bit here, in Omniverse, we see the Omnitrix be influenced by whatever the villain Phil was emitting. Phil being a half-tarantula human hybrid who can feed off of electrical aliens. And for whatever reason, being around him during the episode Max's Monster resulted in the Omnitrix only allowing Ben to transform into any of his electrical aliens. Very much being an ideal situation for Phil. Except for feedback, of course. Actually, in a very similar way, we have the episode Con of Wrath, where whatever electromagnetic adjacent field the little Tiffin was putting out, forcibly unlocking Wrath and keeping Ben in that form. I got right to the end of work on this video and almost forgot to mention, the Omnitrix is very much vulnerable to being messed around with by Ben using a screwdriver. You could absolutely put this down to user error here, Ben actively trying to hack the Omnitrix, with him knocking off the faceplate, resulting in all sorts of alien fusions, series villain Dr. Animo even taking this chance to use the faceplate to create fusions of aliens and animals like we see with the Heat Blast bat. Again, jumping around a bit, that just reminded me, speaking of outside damage and the first use of the DNA acquisition sequence, we have the time the Leboan, or as he was seen at the time, the Yen Dushi, scratching the Omnitrix's faceplate, adding the Leboan as a transformation into the Omnitrix, but doing so at a slow, unconventional way that mirrored Ben slowly transforming into a werewolf over time. You'd probably be safe to assume it was due to the Omnitrix getting the DNA while also receiving a bit of damage. The episode would have likely played out very differently had the failsafe protecting the Omnitrix gone off, preventing the scratch and hitting the Leboan with that energy wave. Then there's the Omnitrix's clear vulnerability to all sorts of magic, the most notable example being everything surrounding the Destroy All Aliens film, where Gwen's magic incidentally hit Ben as upgrade. Then following the recalibration in Alien Force, magic didn't really seem to be much of a factor. And speaking of, following the jump from Classic to Alien Force, we have a few new issues and malfunctions popping up after recalibrated. Especially as we see aliens like Chromostone and later Terraspin have no issue with absorbing or nullifying magic, and we even have Gwen able to cast spells on the Ultimatrix and later enter the device alongside Ben and use all her anodite abilities without causing any harm or issue, but again that's the Ultimatrix and that could be its own video itself. And speaking of, following the jump from Classic to Alien Force, we have a few new issues and malfunctions popping up. To quote Derek J. Wyatt, in regards to some technical issues with the recalibrated Omnitrix, as well as the Ultimatrix, when asked about the somewhat limited positioning of the Omnitrix on each alien form after the Classic series, Derek saying, this actually caused interference with transformations such as power glitches that would cause random flight and abilities not native to alien species Ben changed into, as well as leaving all the aliens naked and cold. Now on that, even though it's a direct quote, I don't know how concrete that information really is. It's certainly a crew statement, but to the best of my knowledge, we never see random abilities that aren't consistent with later appearances of aliens all too often, if at all. Though I could very well be wrong there, I do know we get a lot of one-off powers, but it doesn't really seem like they're not native to the species. On the random glitches come Alien Force onwards, we do certainly have the lack of clothing that was so prevalent in Alien Force that was sorted come Omniverse. That is for everyone other than Wrath, but even then, he does end up getting an outfit of his own after Ben realizes he's been running about the place naked. Back to what can very well be blamed on user error, there's the time Ben convinced Kevin to give him a hand in essentially jailbreaking Omnitrix, trying to force master control, resulting in an explosion that would mutate Kevin for the rest of the duration of Alien Force and beyond that, releasing a bunch of aliens from the device in physical, mindless form, running about the place entirely operating off instinct until Ben could use the DNA acquisition sequence to get them right back in there. And on top of that, had the DNA samples not been in the Omnitrix again, they would have fallen apart into nothing in 24 hours time. So definitely down to user error, but it does seem like a strange glitch error, whatever you want to call it. And I don't know if you'd call this next one a glitch, but it's certainly an example of not being the norm. We do have the time the Omnitrix created a hybrid of a human and an alien in the form of Nanomech during the live-action Ben 10 Alien Swarm film. This being especially odd seeing the Omnitrix is fully capable of scanning corrupt or unusual DNA like a DNA alien, a mutant or an amalgam Kevin, but doesn't as a way of safeguarding itself from corrupted or damaged DNA. On that, I failed to mention earlier, it's not really hugely relevant to glitches, errors, and all that, but the Omnitrix does have the ability to repair DNA like we see Ben do with the hybrid. Which leads me to the question, why didn't the Omnitrix repair an amalgam Kevin, Ultron Agregor, or actually really any of Kevin's amalgam forms at all really? Surely they'd be seen as corrupted or damaged, at least by the Omnitrix. Moving on from that, by the time we get to Omniverse, we don't really seem to be introduced to any new issues beyond what we've seen in previous series. Which makes sense given this is a completed Omnitrix. You would reasonably assume it'd be the least flawed of the bunch, but back to magic just for a moment, I don't know if you really want to call this an honorable mention or whatever. There's the one time in Omniverse where after one magical golem bites the Omnitrix, from there on Ben only has access to Ghost Freak on the Omnitrix's dial. Though I couldn't work out exactly why that would be, I know Zascare makes his Omniverse debut in the last seconds of the same episode, but I couldn't quite connect the dots here. Maybe this golem came into contact with Zeskera is probably the best I've got. Just to rattle off a set of largely inconsequential ones, before we wrap things up, I don't know if you'd exactly call it an error, but whenever Ben's sick, like in the very famous Classic Series episode, or the less consequential cold he gets in Alien Force, his aliens are also affected by that sickness. Wild might not be able to use his radar vision, Forearm's getting hives, and more famously, Heatblast swapping out his abilities for cold ones. There's also the many examples of alien DNA I don't want to be as dramatic to say corrupting the user, but certainly influencing them. Like with Wrath, Vampire, or whoever, you'd think the Omnitrix would have something to safeguard the user's mental state. And taking a step back from individual examples and jumping all over the place, from an audience standpoint or even really a showrunner's perspective, I'd imagine, these errors add a very prominent element to the show that in one way or another make the series much more interesting, forcing Ben to adapt to any given situation or give us fun one-off episodes, with Ben slowly transforming over the runtime of an episode, or Ben and the others having to track down living transformations, running amok around the place. I personally think nearly every failure leads to, if nothing else, interesting storytelling. If you've made it this far into the video and aren't subscribed, please consider doing so. Either way, I appreciate you being here.